The notice had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Marlene finally allowed herself to read it all the way through. She had picked it up twice already, gotten as far as the second paragraph, and set it back down. Not because she didn't understand it. She understood it perfectly. That was exactly the problem. The language was clean and legal, precise in the way that only letters designed to remove something from your life ever managed to be. 90 days. The phrase sat in the middle of the page like a stone in still water, sending its meaning outward in every direction. 90 days to bring the balance current or vacate the premises. She folded the letter along its original crease and placed it face down on the counter, then turned to the window above the sink and looked out at the narrow backyard where her daughter Maya was drawing with chalk on the concrete steps. Maya was 7. She drew the way 7-year-olds drew, with full commitment and no concern for proportion. A purple horse, with wings larger than its own body, a house with a sun in every corner of the sky. She had no idea that the house she had drawn moons and flowers on with her sidewalk chalk might not be theirs in 3 months. Marlene pressed her fingertips against the edge of the counter and breathed. She had learned to breathe in a particular way over the last 2 years, slowly, through the nose, while holding for just a moment at the top before releasing. Her sister called it her controlled breathing. Her sister meant it as a compliment. Marlene used it the way a person used a handrail on a staircase that had no business being as steep as it was. She used it to keep from falling. The job at the distribution center had ended 7 months ago, not with drama, not with a confrontation or a performance review gone wrong, but with a restructuring announcement made on a Tuesday morning in a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and someone's old lunch. 34 positions eliminated. Her name had been on the list. She had taken the envelope from the HR coordinator with both hands, thanked the woman, walked to her locker, taken out the photograph of Maya that she kept taped inside the door, and driven home without crying. She had saved the crying for the shower, which was where she did most of it these days, quietly under running water, so that Maya wouldn't hear. Since then, she had worked. That was the only word for it that felt honest. She had worked with the disciplined, relentless energy of someone who understood that stopping meant sinking. She took shifts at a grocery store 3 mornings a week, did bookkeeping remotely for a small landscaping company on the side, picked up occasional data entry contracts through a platform that paid barely enough to justify the hours, and watched her savings diminish with an almost geometric precision that would have been fascinating if it had been happening to someone else. She kept a notebook in the kitchen drawer with her expenses written in columns, the way her mother had taught her to keep track of money when money was something that required tracking. The columns had stopped balancing months ago. She had thought about moving back to her mother's house. Her mother had offered more than once, quietly, the way her mother did everything, without making a scene of generosity. Marlene had considered it seriously for about a week before Maya came home from school and described a new friend in elaborate detail. A girl named Priya, who lived 2 streets over and had a dog named Biscuit, who could do tricks. And Marlene had decided that stability had a cost, and she was willing to keep paying it a little longer. The school was good. Maya was happy. Those were facts she measured against the numbers in her notebook, and for now, they still outweighed them. The call from her father's lawyer came on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, when the light outside was doing what early spring light did, promising more than it could deliver. She almost didn't answer. She didn't recognize the number, and she had been screening her calls for weeks out of a general low-grade dread of things arriving from directions she hadn't anticipated. But something made her pick up. The lawyer's name was Gerald Poole. He had a voice like a man who had spent decades delivering news that people hadn't asked for, measured and patient, with a careful neutrality that managed to communicate both sympathy and the limits of sympathy at the same time. He told her that her father's estate had been finalized. She was aware of this. Her father had passed 14 months ago, and while they had not been close in the way that proximity measures closeness, she had attended the funeral and signed the paperwork and received a small amount that she had put toward 3 months of mortgage payments. Gerald Poole told her that there had been a complication with one portion of the estate, a property that had been under dispute and had only recently cleared probate. He told her that this property now belonged to her. She asked him what property. He told her. She sat down on the kitchen floor. The Calloway Casino had operated for a period of about 11 years, beginning in the late 1970s, in a small county in the eastern part of the state, where gambling had existed in a particular legal gray zone that lasted just long enough for a handful of establishments to grow, flourish briefly, and then encounter the full force of regulatory correction. The Calloway had been one of the smaller ones, not the glamorous sort of casino that appeared in films, not the neon and velvet kind, with showgirls and chandelier light, but the working-class kind. A 2-story building on a road that used to see more traffic, built with the practical ugliness of a structure designed to function rather than to impress. It had closed in 1991. Marlene's father had come to own it through a series of transactions that Gerald Poole explained carefully, and that she followed with about 70% comprehension, understanding enough to know that it had been acquired as partial payment for a debt owed to him by a man who had later died, without descendants, and without any other party willing to take on the complications of the ownership. Those complications, Gerald Poole explained, were considerable. The property had outstanding tax liens. Environmental assessments were required before any sale could proceed. There were questions about the structural integrity of the building. The county had issued notices over the years. There were records of partial cleanup attempts that had not been completed. The legal and administrative mess that surrounded the Calloway Casino was, in Gerald Poole's measured professional language, not insignificant. The assessed value of the property, after liens and obligations were factored in, came to $850. She asked him to repeat that. He did. She sat on the kitchen floor for a long time after the call ended. Maya was in the other room watching a nature documentary about migration patterns, her small voice occasionally asking questions at the screen. Outside, the early spring light had softened into something almost golden. Marlene looked at the folded letter on the counter, and then at the notebook in the kitchen drawer, and then at her own hands on the linoleum floor, and she thought about her father, who had been a man of small gestures and large silences, who had moved through the world, leaving behind him a trail of unfinished things. She thought about the $850. She thought about 90 days. Her sister Denise called it the worst idea she had ever heard. And Denise had heard most of Marlene's ideas over the course of 41 years, including the one that led to the purchase of the van that broke down twice in the first month, and once more dramatically on an interstate highway on the way to a vacation that never quite happened. Denise had a gift for cataloging Marlene's missteps with the thoroughness of someone who had loved her long enough to have kept records. They sat at Denise's kitchen table on a Saturday morning, while Marlene spread out the documents Gerald Poole had sent. There were photographs attached, grainy printouts from the county assessor's office, showing the exterior of the Calloway Casino in its current state. The images were not encouraging. The parking lot had been reclaimed by vegetation that had pushed up through the cracked asphalt, with the patient determination of things that grow when no one is watching. The facade of the building was intact in the structural sense, but had weathered into something that communicated abandonment with great efficiency. Windows on the upper floor were covered with plywood that had darkened over the years. A chain-link fence surrounded part of the property, sagging in places, missing entirely in others, as though it had given up trying to deter anyone. Denise looked at the photographs for a long moment. "Marlene," she said, with the tone of someone selecting their words with the care of a person who wants to be honest, but also doesn't want to be cruel. This is a ruin. I know what it looks like. It looks like a place where a movie villain would hide a body. The structure is sound. The lawyer said the last inspection confirmed the main building is structurally intact. The lawyer who is representing your dead father's estate and wants to close the file. Marlene pulled the photographs back toward herself. The land alone is worth something. The liens are manageable if you spread them over a sale timeline. I've looked into it. You've looked into it, Denise repeated, not as agreement, not as skepticism, but as the kind of echo that meant she was processing something she didn't want to believe she was hearing. There's a commercial developer who's been acquiring property in that county. I found filings. They're building a distribution corridor. 3 properties within 2 miles of the Calloway have already sold in the last 18 months. Denise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So your plan is to take an $850 derelict casino, fix it up enough to sell, and time it to a commercial real estate wave. Not fix it up, just stabilize it enough to make it presentable for sale. Clear the liens, address the environmental requirements, make it legally viable. Then list it. With what money?" This was the question Marlene had been sitting with for 2 weeks. The answer was not comfortable, but it was an answer. She had done the math repeatedly, checking it from different angles the way you check the load-bearing capacity of a bridge before you put your weight on it. The savings she had left, combined with what remained of the small inheritance distribution and a personal loan she had been approved for, would cover the liens and the environmental assessment, and leave just enough for basic stabilization work. Just enough, if nothing unexpected happened. The margin was not forgiving. "It's a risk," she said. "I know it's a risk." "It's gambling," Denise said, which is ironic given the building. "Everything I've done for the last 2 years has been a risk. Staying in the house is a risk. Every week is a risk. At least this one has a potential end. At least this one has an exit that isn't just surviving until the next thing." Denise looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her expression that was not quite disagreement. It was more like recognition, the reluctant kind. She had watched Marlene survive the last 2 years with a steadiness that she privately found both admirable and terrifying. She knew that the steadiness was not the absence of fear. She knew exactly what it was built on. She reached across the table and touched Marlene's hand briefly, then pulled back. "If you're doing this," she said, "don't do it alone. Let me help where I can. I need you to watch Maya on the weekends I'm out there." "Obviously." Denise looked at the photographs again. "What on earth possessed your father to end up with a thing like that?" "He never met a debt settlement he didn't accept," Marlene said. "In that, at least, but he was consistent." The drive out to the Calloway Casino took just under 2 hours on a Saturday in late April, when the countryside was doing what countryside did in late April, showing off in the way of things that have been dormant a long time and are now overcompensating. The fields along the highway were green with the particular intensity of early growth. The sky was cloudless and high. Maya sat in the back seat with her headphones on, watching something on the tablet, occasionally narrating portions of it to Marlene without any apparent expectation of a response, which was fine because Marlene was navigating with half her mind and turning things over with the other half. She had done everything she could to prepare herself for what she was going to find. She had studied the photographs carefully. She had read the inspection reports, including the parts that used language like deferred maintenance and evidence of prior water intrusion and recommending professional assessment before habitation. She had adjusted her expectations downward several times over the course of the past 3 weeks, ratcheting them toward whatever honest baseline would allow her to see the property without despair. She turned off the highway onto a 2-lane road that straightened out through a stretch of second-growth forest and then opened onto what she recognized from the photographs as the approach to the Calloway. The chain-link fence appeared first, along the roadside, its posture uneven and exhausted. Then the building itself came into view, and Marlene felt her stomach perform a quiet adjustment. The photographs had been accurate. In that sense, she had been well prepared. What the photographs had not conveyed was the particular quality of the silence around it. Not just the absence of activity, but the presence of a specific kind of quiet that old, abandoned buildings accumulated over decades. The quiet of a place that had heard a great deal of noise and had been given a long time to forget it. The parking lot, which had once presumably been filled on weekend evenings with the cars of people making their particular calculations of chance, was now a study in organic reclamation. Crabgrass and thistle had colonized the cracked asphalt with thorough patience. 2 light poles leaned at slight angles in their concrete bases. A faded sign near the entrance, its letters once red, had been reduced by weather to a color somewhere between rust and apology. Maya took off her headphones and looked through the window. "Is this it?" she said. This is it." Maya studied the building with the frank appraisal of a child who had not yet learned to soften her assessments for the feelings of the person beside her. "It looks like it's from a scary movie," she said. "It looks like it needs some attention. A lot of attention." Maya pressed her face closer to the glass. "Are there bats?" "Probably not." "Probably," Maya repeated, with the precision of someone who knew the difference between probably and no. Marlene parked along the fence line and sat for a moment looking at the building. In the daylight, it was less sinister than the photographs had made it feel, and more simply sad. The way things were sad that had once served a purpose and had been left without ceremony to manage their own decline. The main structure was a large rectangular building, 2 stories, with a flat roof line that showed a few areas of sagging, but nothing that looked catastrophic. The lower windows were intact, protected by the grime of years and, in some cases, covered with boards that had held. The entrance doors were double, metal-framed, padlocked with a chain. She had the key in her jacket pocket, provided by Gerald Poole, along with a set of documents she had reviewed several times. She had told herself, driving here, that she would not feel anything until she had seen everything. She would approach this the way she approached her expense notebook, systematically, without flinching, on noting what was there and what it meant, without allowing hope or despair to interfere with the assessment. She was a woman who had learned to defer feeling until the facts were complete. It was a survival skill. It was also, she recognized, something that had cost her in ways she didn't always want to examine. She got out of the car. The air had a particular smell, the countryside mixing with the faintly chemical undercurrent that the inspection report had noted and attributed to prior cleaning materials used during a partial remediation effort years ago. It was not overwhelming. It was background. She stood at the fence line and looked at the building straight on for a long moment, then reached into her bag for the document folder and her notebook and walked toward the entrance. Maya followed, staying close but not touching anything, watching the building with wide eyes that tracked every detail the way only children's eyes tracked things. She had been told to stay close and not touch, and she was honoring the first instruction more faithfully than the second, her fingers occasionally brushing fence posts and signage with a light curiosity she probably thought Marlene wasn't noticing. The padlock opened on the second attempt with the key. The chain fell with a sound that was louder than expected, metallic and final, and Maya startled and grabbed Marlene's sleeve. Marlene pushed open the right-hand door, and it moved with surprising ease, its hinges protesting only slightly, as though it had been expecting this. The interior smell was different. Closed air, decades old, with layers she couldn't fully identify. Something musty and flat overlaid with the ghost of cigarette smoke from a different era, and beneath that, something else she couldn't name. Something cold and mineral that had nothing to do with cigarettes or time. The light from the open door reached only so far into the darkness. She clicked on the flashlight she had brought. The main floor opened before her in the beam. It was a large single space, lower ceilinged than she had imagined, with support columns spaced across it at intervals. The carpet had long been destroyed, peeling away from the concrete floor beneath in strips that curled like old skin. The gaming floor had been cleared of its equipment at some point, though the configuration was still visible in the layout, in the paths of wear in the floor surface, and the positions of the electrical outlets and lighting rigs that hung dark overhead. Against the far wall, a bar counter ran the length of the space, its surface dull with grime, but its structure intact, the shelves behind it empty and cobwebbed. She moved forward slowly, playing the flashlight across the room. A second door on the left wall was marked with a sign whose text was too faded to read. On the right side, a staircase led to the upper floor. Straight ahead, beyond the bar, a short corridor led into a back section she hadn't been able to see in the photographs. She noted everything in her book as she walked, recording the condition of the floor, the ceiling, the walls. The ceiling showed water staining in one quadrant, consistent with what the inspection report had flagged. The walls were cinder block in the lower section, drywall above, and the drywall had buckled in a few places, but hadn't collapsed. The electrical panel, which she found behind a door near the entrance, was old, but had been disconnected in an orderly way. Nothing here felt structurally catastrophic. Shabby, yes. Neglected beyond what time alone could explain, but not collapsing. She took photographs methodically, moving through the space the way the inspector had moved through it, a quadrant by quadrant, low to high. Maya stayed near the entrance, alternating between boredom and alert attention whenever something unusual appeared in the flashlight beam. "Mom," Maya said from near the door. "I see it," Marlene said, though she wasn't looking at Maya. "You're not looking at me. What is it, baby?" "There's a picture on the wall over here." Marlene walked back toward the entrance. On the wall just inside the door, mostly obscured by a board that had partially fallen, was a framed photograph. It was large, about the size of a movie poster, protected by glass that had developed a film of grime but had not cracked. She used her sleeve to wipe a portion of the glass and pointed the flashlight at it. The photograph showed the interior of the casino in its operating days. It was a large group photo, perhaps taken for an anniversary. People in the clothing of the late 1970s filling the frame. The gaming floor behind them was lit with the confident brightness of a place that expected to be visited for a long time. The bar was stocked. The room was full. Everyone in the photograph was smiling with the uncomplicated cheerfulness of people who did not know what was coming. She looked at the photograph for a long moment before setting the board carefully to one side. She thought about the people in the image, about all the evenings this room had held, on the noise and the light, and the ordinary human drama of people deciding to believe in luck. She thought about her father, who had come to own this place at the end of a chain of events neither of them had chosen. A debt settling into inheritance, time compressing circumstance into property. She thought about the 90-day notice on her kitchen counter and the columns in her notebook, and Maya drawing horses with wings on the backyard steps. She straightened and turned back to the room. Come on," she said to Maya. "Let's see the rest of it." The back corridor led to what had once been a staff area, a break room with a metal table and 2 chairs still in place, a supply room empty of everything except the shadows of its former contents, and a narrow room that had presumably served as the manager's office, its desk still there, scarred by years and stripped of anything of value but present, like furniture that had decided outlasting its usefulness was its own form of purpose. She noted all of it. She photographed all of it. She was careful not to allow the shabbiness to become discouraging, to keep measuring rather than feeling. There would be time for feeling when she understood what she had. The staircase to the upper floor was wooden, which she had not expected, and creaked under her weight with a seriousness that made her test each step before committing to it. The upper floor was smaller than the main, occupying only the rear portion of the building, and appeared to have been used for storage and for a secondary operations area. There were old metal shelving units lining one wall, several filing cabinet frames, emptied. A door at the end of a short hallway that was padlocked. She stood in front of the padlocked door. The inspection report had mentioned this room. It was described as a secondary storage area, access restricted pending assessment. The reason given for the restriction was unspecified. And Gerald Poole had not had a key for this particular lock, and the report recommended specialist assessment before entry. She had noted this. She had planned to deal with it eventually. Standing in front of the door now, flashlight casting its beam across the padlock and the closed frame, she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not curiosity exactly, though curiosity was part of it. Something older and less rational than curiosity. The particular awareness of a boundary that draws attention by its own existence. There was no reason for a room in an abandoned casino to be padlocked that didn't have an explanation. Locks were practical. They were used when someone decided something needed to be kept closed. Someone had decided this. She noted it in her book and moved on. Back on the main floor, she walked the perimeter one more time. This time without the notebook, just looking. She was trying to see past the decades of neglect to the underlying structure, trying to understand what the building had been built to be before it became what it was now. The construction was solid. She could feel that. The walls were thick. The support columns were placed with the confidence of something built to last. Whoever had put up the Calloway Casino in the 1970s had not cut corners on the structure itself. They had built a building that intended to be used for a long time. So she wondered about the people who had built it, about the ambitions they had carried through these same doors on the first day, the scale of what they imagined this space would become and hold. She wondered what her father had thought when he received the deed as payment for a debt. Had he ever come here? Had he walked this floor? He was not a man who talked about his properties. He was not a man who talked about much. He had moved through the world at a deliberate remove that she had spent most of her life trying to interpret, and had largely stopped trying after her mother died. She stood in the middle of the empty casino floor for a long moment, the flashlight in her hand, and the notebook under her arm, and the smell of closed decades around her. The building had been a place where people came to try their luck. She supposed she was continuing the tradition. On the drive back, Maya fell asleep in the back seat before they had cleared the county. Marlene drove through the fading afternoon light with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. She had spent the last several hours making assessments, recording conditions, keeping her reactions at a careful distance. Now, in the quiet of the highway with her daughter sleeping behind her, she allowed herself to think about what she had seen and what it might mean. The building was manageable. She had been afraid it would be unsalvageable, and it wasn't. The work required was real, but it was not impossible. She could see the shape of it clearly enough to price it roughly, to understand what needed to happen in what order. The liens would take most of the money, but the stabilization work, the minimum necessary to make the property legally presentable for sale, was within range if she was careful, and if she did as much as she could herself. She had called 2 contractors before the visit, using references she had found through the county records, asking for rough estimates based on the inspection report. Both had been honest with her in the way that good contractors were honest, naming the work clearly and the costs plainly, and not pretending that anything would be easier than it was. She had written their numbers in her notebook. They fit, barely, in the column that needed them to fit. She thought about the padlocked door on the upper floor. There was no particular reason to think about it. It was a door. Abandoned buildings had locked doors for 100 unremarkable reasons. But it sat in the corner of her mind, the way small, unresolved things sat, present without urgency, waiting. She thought about the photograph near the entrance, the crowd of people in the casino's good years, all of them facing the camera with the particular confidence, of a moment they expected to last. She thought about how little any moment lasted and how that was not, when you really thought about it, as discouraging as it felt. Things changed. Rooms emptied. Properties passed through hands. Debts became deeds. Deeds became chances. The highway opened ahead of her into the long, pale evening. She was going to do this. She had known that before she drove out there, but she knew it differently now. She knew it the way you knew things that had moved from decision into resolve, the way a choice hardened when it met the actual shape of what it was choosing. The Calloway Casino was hers. It was broken and overgrown and padlocked in places, and it smelled like 40 years of closed air. It was also, by any honest measurement, the most significant thing she had ever been given. She was going to be careful with it. She was going to be systematic and patient, and she wasn't going to let hope outrun information. But she was also, in the quiet dark of that drive home with Maya asleep and the road unspooling ahead, going to let herself believe, just a little, that her father had not left her nothing after all. She reached over and turned on the radio. Something old and soft came through the speakers, the kind of music that asked nothing of you, that was simply there to fill the space. She turned it up just enough to hear it, and drove toward home. The first weekend she went back alone. Denise had Maya. Marlene arrived at the Calloway on a Friday evening with her car loaded with cleaning supplies, a box of tools borrowed from Denise's garage, and the kind of practical determination she had learned to inhabit like a second skin. She worked until the light failed and returned Saturday morning, before the dew had dried on the parking lot weeds. She started on the main floor, working section by section, clearing debris that had accumulated near the walls, or removing the fallen boards that had created obstacle courses across the floor, assessing each area with the systematic thoroughness she had applied to everything since the visit with Maya. The work was physical, and it was satisfying in the way that physical work was when it was tied to a purpose that mattered. She found small things as she worked, the detritus that old buildings accumulated, a playing card face down under a broken shelf, and 3 coins corroded past the point of identification near the base of the bar counter, a receipt from a food service supplier dated 1989 that she looked at for a moment before setting aside. Small archaeology, the evidence of ordinary days. On Saturday afternoon, working her way toward the back of the building, she paused in the doorway of the staff corridor. She had been through this section with Maya 2 weeks earlier and had noted it and moved on. Now she walked it more slowly, looking at the walls and the floor with the attention she had been applying everywhere else. The floor in the corridor was concrete, like the main area, but here it had not been covered by carpet at any point. She could see the concrete clearly, and as she moved her flashlight along it, she noticed something she had not noticed before. Near the base of the wall at the end of the corridor, where the manager's office door was, the concrete changed. Not dramatically, though not in a way that would have caught her eye on a first pass. But the texture was different, the color slightly uneven, as though this section had been poured at a different time, or with a different mix. A rectangle roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide sat flush with the surrounding floor, its edges visible only to someone looking carefully in good light at close range. She crouched and ran her hand across it. The surface was smooth. The edges, when she traced them with her fingernail, were clean and precise. This had not happened by accident. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. Then she took out her notebook and wrote down exactly what she saw. She did not do anything about it that day. That was important to her later, when she thought back on the sequence of events and tried to understand her own behavior. She had found something unusual, and she had written it down, and she had kept working. She had not let the discovery reorganize her afternoon or her thinking. She had photographed it from 3 angles, noted its dimensions as accurately as she could measure with the tape she carried in her tool bag, and then she had continued clearing the corridor and completed the section of work she had planned. This was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. It was the discipline of a woman who had learned that the worst thing you could do with something that mattered was to rush at it before you understood what you were looking at. She had seen enough plans collapse from premature momentum to know that the space between discovery and action was not wasted time. It was the most important time. It was when you decided whether you were a person who reacted or a person who thought. She drove home that evening with the photographs on her phone and the measurements in her notebook and the image of the concrete rectangle sitting at the back of her mind with a patience she intended to match. She would come back with more information. She would come back prepared. The following week, she spent 3 evenings doing research that she had not previously known she needed to do. She looked into the construction history of the Calloway Casino, pulling what she could find from county records that had been digitized and from a regional historical archive that maintained records of commercial building permits from the 1970s and 1980s. The original construction permit for the Calloway was on file. The building footprint matched what she had seen. The materials list matched the inspection report. The timeline was consistent with what she had understood about the casino's history, and what she could not find was any permit for subsequent construction on the interior. No record of renovation, no modification of the original floor plan, no structural work filed after the initial build. She checked 3 separate databases. She called the county building records office and asked a clerk named Beverly to do a search by address. Beverly called back the next day and confirmed what the databases had shown. So no permitted interior work had been recorded for the Calloway Casino after its original construction in 1978, which meant that whatever had been laid in that corridor floor had been laid without a permit. Or it predated the building itself, which was architecturally improbable given what she had seen. Or the permit existed somewhere she hadn't looked. She held all 3 possibilities with equal neutrality and planned her next visit accordingly. She went back on a Thursday evening when the late spring light lasted long enough to give her 2 solid hours before dark. She brought a cold chisel, a hammer, a pry bar, a stronger flashlight, and the particular kind of focus that came from having thought about something carefully for a week without acting on it. Maya was at Denise's. Marlene had the time and the silence and the absence of any obligation except the one she had made to herself. She stood in the corridor for a moment before crouching down, looking at the concrete rectangle again in the better light of the stronger flashlight. From this angle, crouching low, she could see something she had missed before. Along one of the shorter edges, the edge nearest the wall, the seam between the newer concrete and the old, was marginally wider than on the other 3 sides. Barely visible, a millimeter, perhaps 2, but consistent along that entire edge, as though something ran beneath it there, a hinge point or a seam designed to allow movement. She placed the cold chisel carefully along that edge and tapped it lightly with the hammer. The sound that came back was different from what she expected. Not the solid density of concrete poured over concrete. Something with a hollow register underneath, brief and deep, like tapping the lid of a large, empty container. She stopped. She sat back. She held the hammer loosely in one hand and looked at the floor. Hollow. She tapped again in 4 places along the edge, each tap precise and measured. The hollow resonance was consistent. It was not loud, not dramatic, not the thunderous emptiness of a film discovery. It was quiet and factual, the way all the most significant things were quiet and factual when they arrived. A sound that said, "There is space here that you did not know about." She worked the chisel along the seam methodically, applying pressure gradually, not forcing, feeling for the give that she now knew was there. The concrete along the edge was thin, thinner than the rest. She could tell from the resistance. It had been laid as a seal, not as a floor. 20 minutes of careful work, and a section of the edge cracked cleanly along its own seam. She cleared the broken edge and found, beneath it, a metal lip. Brushed steel, recessed into a channel. A handle, essentially. Built flush with the surrounding construction and covered with the concrete overlay. She sat on the floor of the corridor of the abandoned Calloway Casino in the late spring evening light and looked at the metal lip in the floor. Then she pulled. The panel lifted with a resistance that was primarily the weight of the concrete topping, which had been laid in a single piece over a steel plate. The whole assembly hinged at the wall edge, exactly as she had suspected. It was heavy, and she used the pry bar for leverage and worked it up in stages, resting it against the wall when it reached vertical, the concrete seal cracking along its outer edges as it moved, releasing the closed air beneath in a breath that was different from the rest of the building. Cooler, drier. The smell of a sealed space that had not exchanged air with the outside in a very long time. She pointed the flashlight down. A shaft, concrete walls, smooth and dry. Steel rungs set into the wall, descending into darkness beyond the flashlight's range. The construction was precise and deliberate, the rungs evenly spaced and intact, the walls showing no water damage, no cracks, no signs of intrusion. This had been built to last. This had been built to remain undisturbed. She sat at the edge and shone the light down as far as it would reach. The shaft descended perhaps 15 feet before the light found a floor. She could see what appeared to be a flat surface below, concrete, or dry and clean. She could not see what was on it, only that there was a floor and that the floor was there. She did not go down that night. This was the decision she was most deliberate about, the one she thought about longest before making. She was alone in a building that no one knew she was in, above a shaft of unknown depth leading to a space of unknown content, with no one aware of her location. She was a mother. She had a 7-year-old daughter who was at her sister's house, believing that her mother was doing boring work at the old building. She was not going to descend into an unknown underground space alone, without telling anyone where she was or what she had found. She photographed everything: the concrete panel, the hidden hinge, the metal lip, the shaft, the rungs, the view from above. She photographed from every angle she could manage without descending. She measured the opening, recorded everything in her notebook, replaced the panel as close to its original position as she could manage, and drove home. That night, she called Denise. She did not tell Denise about the shaft. She said she had found something at the property that she wanted to look at more carefully, and she asked if Denise would come with her the following weekend. Denise said yes without asking too many questions, because Denise was her sister and understood, in the way that siblings understood things without being told, that when Marlene asked for company without explanation, the explanation was coming, and it was going to require sitting down. They went on a Saturday. Maya was with a school friend for the afternoon. Marlene drove. Denise sat in the passenger seat with a travel coffee and the expression of someone who was already preparing themselves for something unexpected. Marlene said nothing until they were standing in the corridor, now looking at the panel she had partially lifted and reset the previous Thursday. Then she told Denise everything. She told it in the same order she had experienced it: the first visit, the concrete rectangle, the research, the second visit, the hollow sound, the metal lip, the shaft. Denise listened without interrupting, which was notable. Denise was not a person who listened without interrupting as a general rule. When Marlene finished, Denise looked at the panel for a long moment. "You're going down there," Denise said. "We're going down there." Denise looked at her. "I wore good shoes. I told you to wear work boots. I thought that was a metaphor." They lifted the panel together. The effort was easier with 2 people, and the concrete seal, already cracked from the previous opening, came apart cleanly at the edges, revealing the shaft and the rungs exactly as Marlene had left them. The cool, sealed air breathed upward again. Now Marlene clipped the stronger flashlight to her belt and tested the top rung with her full weight before beginning to descend. The rungs were solid. Every one she tested held without flexing. The construction of the shaft was, if anything, more impressive up close than it had appeared from above. The walls smooth poured and plumb, the rungs set with the uniformity of work done by someone who expected them to be used repeatedly and under pressure. This had not been a quick project. Someone had built this with care and resources, and the intention that it would function exactly as it was functioning now, 30 or more years later. She reached the bottom and stood on the floor of the space below. The flashlight reached the walls in every direction. She was in a room, a proper room, not a shaft or a crawl space or a utility corridor, but a deliberate enclosed space, roughly rectangular, perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide. The ceiling was low, perhaps 7 feet, and the same smooth poured concrete as the walls. The floor was clean, dry, with a thin layer of fine dust that had settled over years of stillness. She turned slowly, taking it in. The room wasn't empty. Along the right wall, from floor to halfway up, ran a continuous metal shelving unit, bolted to the wall at regular intervals. On the shelves were cases. They were uniform in size and construction, rectangular, built from what appeared to be a dark finished metal, each roughly the size of a large suitcase laid flat. They were stacked 2 deep on each shelf, with small identification markers affixed to each one that she could not read from this distance. There were a great many of them. She counted 3 shelves running the full length of the wall, each shelf holding perhaps 20 cases. She did not do the arithmetic immediately. The left wall held a different kind of storage. Mounted to the wall was a series of narrow metal drawers, and the kind used in industrial settings for parts storage, perhaps 30 drawers in a grid of 5 across and 6 tall. Each drawer had a small label slot, most of them empty, several containing small paper labels, whose text she could not yet read. Against the far wall was a single table, metal, bolted to the floor, its surface bare except for a flat metal case that was different from the others, larger and thicker, sure with a locking mechanism on each side that was different from the simpler closures on the shelved cases. Beside it sat a small sealed envelope, white, yellowed with age, placed with the deliberateness of something left for someone specific to find. She stood very still for a moment. Above her, she heard Denise descending the rungs. Denise reached the floor and stood beside her. Her coffee was still in her hand. She looked at the room. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the table and the sealed envelope. She looked at Marlene. "What is this?" Denise said, and it was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that asked for the world to slow down and explain itself. "I don't know," Marlene said honestly. She crossed to the shelving unit and examined the nearest case without touching it. The metal was dark and clean, the surface undamaged. The locking mechanism was a simple 2-point clasp, not padlocked, not requiring any special tool. The identification marker on the front was a small laminated card with a handwritten number. She leaned in and read it. 001. She looked at the next one. 002. She looked at the ones above. 003. 004. All the way down the shelf, numbered sequentially, cleanly, with the handwriting of someone who had done this cataloging carefully. She turned to the table and approached the sealed envelope. She picked it up carefully. The paper was brittle but intact. Nothing was written on the outside. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was slight, just 1 or 2 sheets inside. She looked at Denise. "Open it," Denise said. She opened it carefully, working the seal slowly to avoid tearing the aged paper. Inside were 2 folded pages, handwritten on plain white paper in ink that had darkened to brown with age. The handwriting was consistent and educated, the lines even. The letters formed with a precision that spoke of someone who wrote often and carefully. She read. The letter was not addressed to anyone by name. It began simply, "If you have found this room, then either the time has come for what is stored here to be known, or someone arrived here by means I did not anticipate. In either case, what I have to tell you is the same." She read faster. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was slow and controlled. The letter explained, in the methodical way of someone who had thought about how to say something for a long time, that the contents of the room had been accumulated over a period of approximately 8 years, beginning in the early 1980s, by a man named Richard Calloway, who had built the casino as a legitimate business, but whose deeper and more serious enterprise had been the acquisition and secure storage of what he described in the letter as portable value. The cases on the shelves contained diamonds, not gemstone jewelry, not mounted stones, but loose diamonds, purchased through channels that operated outside conventional markets, stored in graded lots, cataloged by quality and weight. The acquisition had been deliberate, systematic, and conducted with the understanding that diamonds held value across jurisdictions and time in a way that currency did not. Richard Calloway had believed, the letter stated plainly, that the political and economic instability he anticipated in the coming decades would make portable, durable, a universally recognized value not just preferable, but necessary. The letter went on to say that Richard Calloway had died unexpectedly in 1989, and that the letter had been written by his attorney, a man named someone whose signature was at the bottom of the page, as per his client's instructions, to be sealed and left with the collection in the event that the executor of the estate was unable to carry out the intended private transfer. The intended recipient had predeceased the estate's legal resolution. The property had entered a legal dispute that extended beyond what either Calloway or his attorney had anticipated. The attorney himself had died in 1997. The room, as far as the letter could convey, had never been opened by anyone with knowledge of its contents. The flat case on the table, the letter noted, contained documentation for the collection, grading certificates, acquisition records, provenance documentation for each numbered case. The documentation had been prepared by a qualified gemologist retained by Calloway for this purpose. The collection had been independently appraised twice during the acquisition period. The most recent appraisal figures were included in the documentation. She stopped reading. She looked at Denise. Denise was watching her face. "What does it say?" Denise said. Marlene looked back at the letter. She read the final paragraph again. Then she looked at the shelving unit. She counted the cases carefully this time. 3 shelves, approximately 20 cases per shelf, stacked 2 deep. 60 cases on the face of each shelf. 2 rows deep meant she was looking at, she counted again, the mathematics assembling themselves with quiet insistence. The shelves were longer than she had initially estimated. She walked the length of the shelving unit with the flashlight and counted again. 214 cases, and she turned and looked at the numbered case on the nearest shelf. She reached out and unlatched the 2 clasps and lifted the lid. The interior was lined with black foam, cut into a grid of small compartments, each compartment holding a small paper envelope sealed with red wax, each envelope numbered in the same careful hand as the case exterior. The envelopes were packed tightly, filling every compartment. She counted the compartments in this single case. 48. She closed the lid carefully and rested her hands on top of it. Denise had come to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The room held its decades of quiet around them, unchanged, patient, exactly as it had been for 30 years before they climbed down the ladder. "The letter," Denise said. What does the letter say about the value? Marlene looked at the letter again. She found the sentence she had read and read again. The most recent appraisal, conducted in 1988, had assessed the total collection at $87 million. That figure, the letter noted, with the careful precision of a lawyer, reflected market conditions at the time of appraisal and did not account for appreciation or market changes in subsequent years. She said the number out loud. Denise sat down on the floor. Marlene remained standing, the letter in both hands, with the flashlight throwing its beam across the shelves and their 214 cases, and the sealed paper envelopes inside each one, and the flat documentation case on the table, and the room that had been waiting under the floor of a broken-down casino for 34 years. She thought about the 90-day notice on her kitchen counter. She thought about the columns in her notebook. She thought about Maya drawing horses with wings in the backyard, wings out of all proportion to the horse's body, the sun in every corner of the sky. The room was silent around her. She breathed. She told herself to be careful. She told herself that this was not confirmation of anything yet, that a letter in a sealed room did not make her wealthy, that the distance between discovery and verified reality was a distance she had to cross with the same deliberateness she had applied to every step of this process. She told herself that she had been here before in the sense that mattered, at the edge of something that looked like rescue, and she had learned the cost of trusting appearances before they were tested. She crossed to the table and examined the flat documentation case. It was locked, but the locks were combination mechanisms, and she did not have the combination. She did not try to force it. She noted it and photographed it, and set it back exactly as she had found it. She photographed the room systematically, the shelves, the cases, the drawers on the left wall, the table, the letter, each visible case number, the structure of the shaft above them. She photographed everything twice. She placed the letter back in its envelope and the envelope in her jacket pocket. She looked at the room one final time. "We need to leave everything exactly as it is," she said to Denise. Denise looked up from the floor. "I know. We don't touch anything else. We don't move anything. We document and we leave and we get the right people." "I know," Denise said again. She stood. Her legs were unsteady for a moment. She pressed one hand flat against the wall to steady herself, then straightened. She looked at the shelving unit. She looked at Marlene. Something moved through her expression that was not quite emotion, and not quite the absence of it, but somewhere between them. "Your father left you this," she said. Marlene looked at the room. "He left me the building above it," she said. "Someone else left me this." She climbed the ladder first. The evening air hit her face at the top, and she breathed it deliberately, filling her lungs, letting the outside world reassert itself. Denise came up behind her. They replaced the panel together, the cracked edges settling back into approximate position. Marlene photographed the corridor one more time before they left the building. The drive back was quiet. The evening was beautiful in the way evenings in late spring were beautiful, the sky holding its color long past when it should have given it up, the fields and the trees doing the work of absorbing what remained of the light. Marlene drove and did not turn on the radio. Halfway home, Denise said, "What do you do now?" "I call a lawyer," Marlene said. "A good one. One who handles estate law and property law, and can tell me exactly what my rights are to what's in that room. And then? And then I call an appraiser, a certified gemologist with credentials I can verify. I get an independent assessment of what's actually in those cases before I make any assumptions about what any of this is worth." "That's the right answer," Denise said. "It's the only answer." Denise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marlene, yeah, 214 cases. Yeah, 48 envelopes per case. Yeah, and the 1988 appraisal said $87 million. That was 37 years ago. Another silence. Okay, Denise said. She folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window. Okay. The lawyer's name was Patricia Hess, and she came recommended by two sources Marlene trusted, a colleague from her bookkeeping work who had used her for a property dispute, and a legal aid office where Marlene had sought advice during the mortgage complications of the previous year. Patricia Hess had the manner of someone who had heard a great many things in professional contexts and had learned to receive all of them with the same level, assessing calm. She listened to Marlene's account across a desk in an office that smelled of paper and coffee, and the particular industry of someone who worked long hours on things that mattered to people. When Marlene finished, Patricia Hess asked several questions, precise and sequential, and wrote the answers in a legal pad in a handwriting that was nothing like the aged script in the sealed envelope, but carried a similar quality of someone who wrote with the intention of accuracy. When the questions were done, she sat back and looked at Marlene with an expression that was, as far as Marlene could read it, something between serious and carefully composed. The property is in your name, Patricia said, clear and uncontested, as of the probate resolution. Yes. The room is physically within the property boundaries. Based on the shaft position and the room dimensions, yes, it's entirely within the footprint. Then the contents of the room, assuming no competing claim can be established by the estate of Richard Calloway or any surviving heirs, are your property. Can such a claim be established? Patricia tapped her pen against her legal pad once. Calloway died in 1989. His estate was probated. The property itself passed through several ownership chains before your father acquired it. If the contents of that room were not inventoried as part of any prior estate, they were either unknown to the administrators of each estate, which appears to be the case given what the letter describes, or they were knowingly omitted, which would create its own set of complications. We do a thorough title search, trace every ownership transition for the property, so check every probate record from every change of hands. If no prior owner established a formal claim to the room's contents, your title to the property gives you the strongest possible position. She held Marlene's gaze for a moment. I don't want to tell you it's certain, she said. Nothing in property law is certain until it's resolved. But what you've described, a documented sealed space, never inventoried, never claimed, within a property that is now legally and unambiguously yours, is a strong foundation. Marlene nodded. What do I need to do? Patricia told her. She told her specifically and completely, the way good lawyers told people things when the stakes were real. Marlene wrote everything down. The gemologist was named Dr. Adnan Faruqi, and he held credentials from 3 institutions and had been conducting independent appraisals for 22 years. He came to the Calloway on a Tuesday morning with 2 colleagues, an equipment case, and the professional composure of someone who had been told to expect something unusual and was suspending judgment until he had seen it himself. Marlene brought Patricia Hess. She had insisted on this. Whatever happened in that room from this point forward, she wanted a witness who understood the legal significance of every step. They descended the shaft in turn. Dr. Faruqi stood in the room and looked at the shelves for a long moment before he spoke. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "Well, all right." Then he set his case down and began. The process was methodical and took most of the day. Dr. Faruqi worked through a systematic sampling protocol, selecting cases at intervals across the shelving unit, opening them, examining the sealed envelopes, and extracting the contents of selected envelopes for examination with his instruments. His colleagues documented each step photographically and in writing. Patricia Hess observed from near the ladder and said nothing. Marlene stood near the far wall and watched. The diamonds were real. She knew this before Dr. Faruqi said anything definitive, because she watched his face as he worked. And she knew how to read faces that were trying to remain professionally neutral in the presence of something that was making professional neutrality difficult. He examined stone after stone with the particular attention of someone confirming what he was already finding. The grading documents, which Patricia had arranged for a locksmith to access from the flat case on the table, matched the physical contents of the cases with an accuracy that Dr. Faruqi described as remarkable. Calloway's gemologist had been thorough. The catalog was precise. At 4 p.m, Dr. Faruqi asked Marlene if she would come and look at something. He was standing at the shelving unit with one of the cases open before him, its envelopes laid out across the lid in an organized row. He had a loupe in his hand. He held one of the stones up to the flashlight Marlene brought over and asked her to look through the loupe at it. She had never looked at a diamond through a loupe before. She had not expected it to look the way it looked. The interior of the stone held the light in a way that made the light seem to be coming from inside it, rather than simply passing through. It was clear and enormous in the magnification, and it was, unmistakably, extraordinary. "This is not a common stone," Dr. Faruqi said. "This is an exceptional stone. Many of the stones in this collection are exceptional. The original gemologist classified them correctly. These are not commercial grade. These are collector grade, in many cases investment grade, in a few cases beyond any standard category I would apply in ordinary appraisal work." He lowered the loupe. He looked at Marlene. "The diamond market has changed considerably since 1988, he said. The appreciation on stones of this quality, over 37 years, is not modest." She held the look he was giving her without flinching. "What is the current collection worth?" she said. He had been waiting for the question. She could see that he had been holding it, organizing it, deciding how to deliver it in a way that was professionally accurate and not irresponsible. He set the loupe down on the case lid with care. "I will give you a formal written appraisal within 2 weeks, he said. That appraisal will be precise and defensible. What I can tell you now, based on what I have examined today, and the documentation available for the full collection, is a preliminary range." He said the range. Marlene heard it. She held it. She did not look at Patricia Hess. She did not look at the shelves. She looked at Dr. Faruqi, and she held the number he had given her, the way you held something delicate, with both hands, very still, on $290 million at the lower bound of the range, $320 million at the upper. The room was quiet around them. $305 million, he said, was his central estimate. Subject to formal appraisal and market verification. Subject to the legal resolution Patricia was pursuing. So subject to every caveat and qualification that professional responsibility required him to attach to a preliminary number delivered in the basement of an abandoned casino on a Tuesday afternoon. $305 million. She thought about the woman she had been 6 weeks ago, standing at her kitchen counter with the foreclosure notice face down under her fingertips, watching Maya draw in the backyard. She thought about the drive out to the Calloway the first time, the quiet 2 hours of highway with her daughter asleep in the back seat and the radio playing something soft. She thought about her father and the debt that became a deed and the deed that became a chance. She thought about the concrete rectangle in the corridor floor, the hollow sound under the cold chisel, the breath of sealed air rising from the shaft, the letter in its brittle envelope. The cases numbered 1 by 1 in careful handwriting. She thought about the 90 days. She stood in the sealed room 30 feet beneath the casino floor with the flashlight in her hand and 214 cases of extraordinary diamonds catalogued on the shelves beside her, and she breathed the way she had learned to breathe, slowly, through the nose, holding for just a moment at the top. Then she said, "Thank you to Dr. Faruqi," and she turned, and she climbed the ladder back up into the light. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of her life. and she had lived through weeks that had earned that description by more obvious means. There had been the week her mother died, the week her marriage ended, the week she was laid off and drove home with Maya's photograph in her hand, and the particular emptiness of a Tuesday that had changed everything without announcing itself. Those weeks had a weight she could feel in her body, pressing through her bones, making the simple acts of eating and sleeping and answering the phone feel like negotiations with gravity. This was different. This was a weight that pushed upward instead of down. She told no one except Patricia Hess and Denise, and she told both of them that silence was essential until the legal framework was clear. Patricia was already deep in the title search, tracing the Calloway property through every ownership transition with the systematic patience of someone who understood that the difference between a solid legal position and a disputed one was exactly the kind of careful work that most people skipped and later paid for. Denise had told her husband Frank that Marlene was dealing with a complicated estate matter and that it required discretion. And Frank, who had been married to Denise for 19 years and had learned to understand her tone of complete non-negotiation, had nodded and not asked further questions. Marlene went about her regular life with a surface calm that she did not have to manufacture because it grew naturally from the discipline she had been applying to herself for years. She worked her shifts at the grocery store. She completed her bookkeeping hours. She helped Maya with a school project about weather systems that involved a great deal of cotton wool and blue paint, and a level of artistic commitment from Maya that Marlene found deeply moving in ways she could not entirely explain. She ate meals and paid what bills she could, and walked the perimeter of each day with the careful tread of someone crossing uncertain ground. At night, after Maya was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and did not look at the columns of numbers she had been maintaining for 2 years. She looked at a different set of numbers, the numbers Dr. Faruqi had given her, the range he had spoken with the careful qualification of professional responsibility, the central figure that sat in the middle of the range, like a fact that had always been true and was only now being recognized. She did not allow herself to spend the money in her mind. This was deliberate, and it was hard. The mind, freed from constraint, moved immediately toward the concrete particulars of transformation, toward the mortgage balance and Maya's college fund and the medical bill from last year that she had been paying in installments too small to feel like progress. The mind wanted to go there, and she kept pulling it back, gently, the way you redirected a child from the edge of something. Not yet. Not until it was real in every legal sense. And not until Patricia had finished and Dr. Faruqi had submitted his formal appraisal and the structure was in place to protect what had been found. Wanting something badly enough to act foolishly was a risk she had never been able to afford, and she wasn't going to start now. Not when the stakes had risen to a height she still could not quite reconcile with the ordinary kitchen table under her hands. Patricia called on a Thursday morning with a voice that carried information beneath its professional neutrality, the way water carried sediment, visible only if you knew how to look. "The title search is complete," Patricia said. Marlene waited. Richard Calloway's estate was probated in 1991. The property transferred to a holding company. That company dissolved in 1998. The property was acquired by a real estate investment group in 1999, which held it until 2007, when it passed to an individual owner who defaulted on the property taxes in 2011. Your father acquired it through a tax lien resolution in 2012. She paused. In none of these transitions was any inventory conducted of the interior of the building beyond the standard structural assessment. The underground room does not appear in any record associated with any prior ownership. "No competing claim," Marlene said. "No competing claim has been filed. No estate has listed the contents as assets, no insurance record names the collection. You have clear title to the property and everything within it." Another pause. the kind that meant something was being chosen carefully. "Marlene, this is yours." She placed the phone face down on the table and sat with both palms flat on the wood surface and looked at the window where the morning light was coming in at the angle it came in this time of year. Low and warm, touching the counter and the edge of Maya's school drawing that was held to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. The drawing showed their house with a sun in every corner and two figures in the yard, one tall and one small, the small one holding what was either a flower or a very round lollipop. Maya had labeled the figures Mommy and Me in the deliberate capital letters of someone who wanted to be understood. She looked at the drawing for a long time, then she called Patricia back and told her to begin the next phase. Dr. Faruqi's formal appraisal arrived on a Monday, 14 days after the assessment in the room below the casino floor. It was 47 pages long. It was specific, documented, defensible, and cross-referenced with market data and provenance records and comparison sales from international auction houses. The executive summary on the first page stated the total assessed value of the collection, based on current market conditions, quality assessments, and the documentation available for each cataloged lot. $305 million. His central estimate had held. The formal appraisal had confirmed it with the full weight of professional methodology and documented evidence. She read the executive summary 3 times in Patricia's office. Then she read it a 4th time. Patricia sat across the desk and let her read without interruption. When she finally set the document down, Patricia said, "We proceed to the liquidation phase on your timeline and through channels I recommend. There are auction houses, private placement specialists, and institutional buyers who handle collections of this nature. The process will take months, not days, and it will require patience. But the collection is real, the appraisal is solid, and the legal position is clear." She leaned forward slightly. "Ma, there is no version of this that requires you to rush. You have the strongest possible position. Take the time to do it properly." Marlene nodded. She understood proper. She had been doing things properly under conditions that did not reward it for 2 years. Doing things properly when the conditions had finally shifted was, if anything, easier. "There is one more thing," Patricia said. "I recommend you speak with a financial advisor before any communication about this becomes public. You will want structure in place before the first dollar is received. Tax planning, asset protection, a framework for how this changes your financial situation in a way that is sustainable and protected." "Sustainable," Marlene said, and the word felt strange in her mouth in the best possible way. She had not applied that word to her financial situation in a very long time. She told Denise on a Saturday afternoon while Maya was in the backyard. Denise was sitting at Marlene's kitchen table with coffee and the expression of someone who had been holding something tightly for 2 weeks and was waiting for permission to set it down. Marlene placed the executive summary on the table. Denise read it. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with amusement. "You did it," Denise said. Not as congratulation. As recognition, the deepest kind. The kind between sisters that carried every year of shared history in 4 syllables. "The building did it," Marlene said. "I just opened the door." "You found the door," Denise said. "Everyone else walked over that floor for 30 years. Marlene looked at the pineapple magnet on the refrigerator. "Dad found the building," she said. "In his way. The worst possible way. The way he found everything. Through somebody else's debt and nobody's intention. But he found it." Denise was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to be okay with that? With it being from him?" Marlene thought about her father. She thought about the man who had moved through the world at a remove, who had left behind him a collection of unfinished things and one debt settlement that became a deed, that became a chance, that became a sealed room beneath a broken-down casino full of diamonds that had been waiting 3 decades for the right person to find them. She thought about whether the right person part was something she was allowed to believe, whether inheritance required deserving or simply arriving. "I'm going to be okay with everything," she said. "I think that's what's different now." The news did not stay contained forever. Nothing did when the scale was large enough, when the process required the involvement of professionals who had their own professional networks and their own human tendencies toward the remarkable. The story did not break publicly all at once, but arrived in pieces, the way water came through a compromised surface, first in small amounts through unexpected gaps, and then all at once when the structure could no longer hold it. The first person in her life who found out without being told was her neighbor Carl, a man in his 60s who had lived 3 houses down for 11 years and who had an inexplicable but accurate instinct for the movements of other people's lives. He mentioned, carefully and without apparent agenda, that he had heard she was dealing with a property matter of some significance out in the eastern county. She confirmed it, minimally. Carl nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already concluded. The second was her former supervisor at the distribution center, a woman named Janet, who had always been kind to Marlene, in the particular way of people who are genuinely decent, but lack the courage to convert decency into action, when action costs something. Janet called to say she had heard something and hoped Marlene was doing all right, and wanted her to know the door was always open if she ever needed a reference. And Marlene thanked her and felt the muted satisfaction of someone receiving an apology that had arrived at a slight delay, but had arrived nonetheless. The third was Marcus. Marcus was the man she had been seeing briefly, 2 years before, for about 4 months, until he had made the calculation that her financial situation was a trajectory he did not want to attach himself to, and had communicated this in the polite but unmistakable language of someone who had decided that honesty was more tolerable when it was delivered with enough charm to make it difficult to object to. He had said, among other things, that he didn't think she had realistic expectations about where things were headed for her. He had said this with genuine concern in his voice, and she had understood, even as she heard it, that the concern was authentic, but that authenticity was not the same as kindness, and that genuine assessment could still be a form of abandonment. He called on a Wednesday evening. She did not answer. He left a voicemail that she listened to once and deleted. She felt no particular anger. She felt something that was not quite the absence of feeling, and not quite its presence, but something neutral and complete. To it like a door that had been closed long enough that you had stopped being aware of it, and had simply arranged the furniture of your interior life around it, and moved on. She did not call back. The person who was hardest to tell, the conversation she had been arranging and rearranging in her mind for weeks, was Maya's school. Not the school itself, but the community it represented. The parents she saw at pickup and drop-off, the other mothers who knew her as the one who worked 2 jobs and always looked a little tired and brought the store-brand juice boxes to the class parties instead of the ones with the cartoon characters on them. She had not been ashamed of this exactly, but she had been aware of it with the particular awareness of someone who knew that other people noticed small economies and drew conclusions from them. She sat in the parking lot of Maya's school on a Thursday afternoon, waiting for pickup, and watched the other cars arrive. She watched the women and men she had sat beside at school events and fundraisers and the twice-yearly parent-teacher conferences, and she thought about how she had moved through this community as someone defined, at least partially, by what she did not have. The house that might not remain hers, the job she had lost, the margins she was managing. She had carried these things with her in a way that she had tried to make invisible, and that had not been entirely invisible, because nothing was. Because people saw even what you tried not to show them, and what they saw shaped how they understood you. She thought about how that was going to change, not because she needed their recognition. She had stopped needing that at some point in the last 2 years, replaced it with something sturdier and more portable. But because change was real, and it altered the way the world moved around you, regardless of whether you asked for it, and because pretending that the shift hadn't happened was its own kind of falseness, and she had committed herself to honesty in a way that left no room for the comfortable evasions of either direction. Maya came out of the school with her backpack half open and a drawing in one hand, and her left shoe untied, moving with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to doubt her own arrival. She spotted Marlene's car and ran toward it, the drawing held out in front of her like an offering. "Look," Maya said, climbing in and thrusting the drawing forward. "It's a diamond. We learned about minerals today. Mrs. Fairchild said diamonds are the hardest thing in the world, and nothing can scratch them." Marlene took the drawing. It was a diamond, a rendered in Maya's committed and proportionally ambitious style, a large, many-faceted shape filled in with purple crayon and ringed with small stars. It was magnificent. "She's right," Marlene said. "Nothing can scratch them." "Do you know what makes them?" Maya asked, snapping her seatbelt with the authority of a child who had been reminded about seatbelts many times and had recently decided to preempt the reminder. "Pressure," Marlene said. "Why, and time." Maya considered this with the seriousness she brought to facts about the natural world. "That makes sense," she said. Then she looked at the drawing. "Can I keep this?" "I was going to ask if I could," Marlene said. Maya looked at her with the candid appraisal she brought to everything. "You can have it," she said. "I'll make another one." Marlene folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the center console. Then she pulled out of the parking lot and drove home. The first call with the auction specialist Patricia had connected her with happened on a Monday morning in a conference room that Marlene had borrowed from a business center downtown, choosing it over Patricia's office because she wanted a space that was hers for the duration of the conversation, not borrowed. The specialist's name was Helene Voss, and she was based in New York, but had handled collections from every continent and had the particular composure of someone who was rarely surprised and did not require the pretense of being surprised to remain engaged. Helene reviewed the appraisal documents before the call. She had questions, precise and sequential, about provenance and documentation and the physical condition of the collection. She was satisfied with the answers. She explained the process she recommended: a private placement first for the exceptional stones, selective auction for the larger lot categories, direct institutional sale for the bulk of the collection. The timeline, handled properly, was 18 to 24 months for full liquidation. "You could move faster," Helene said. "But faster costs you. Collections like this, with this level of quality and documentation, rewarded with patience." "I have patience," Marlene said. Helene looked at her through the screen with the slight narrowing of attention that meant she was reassessing. "How did you come to own this?" she asked. Not prurient curiosity, professional calibration. Marlene told her the condensed version. The inheritance, the assessed value of $850, the 2 visits to the property, the concrete rectangle in the floor, the shaft, the room. Helene was quiet for a moment. "You bought it for $850, she said. "I inherited it. But there were liens and fees. All told, about $4,200 in costs to clear the legal path." $4,200? "Yes." Another brief silence. "I've handled collections for 40 years, Helene said. "I've never encountered anything quite like this." She said it with a precision that suggested she was choosing not to say several other things alongside it, things that were true, but not professional. "Neither have I," Marlene said. The work of the following months was different from any work she had done before, not in its demand. She had been working without pause for 2 years, and the pace did not frighten her, but in its character. Every step now had a direction. Every decision was part of a sequence that was moving towards something instead of simply holding position. She had spent so long in the mode of maintenance, keeping things stable, preventing collapse, absorbing losses, and adjusting and absorbing again, that the experience of working toward rather than working against felt strange and enormous and occasionally overwhelming in a way that she had not anticipated. She paid off the mortgage. She did this first, before the primary liquidation had even begun, using a bridge arrangement Patricia had structured. On the day the balance cleared to 0, she stood in her kitchen and held the piece of paper that confirmed it, and felt something move through her that she could not precisely name, and something that was not celebration, but was adjacent to it, the particular release of a weight you had carried so long that its absence felt at first like instability. Maya did not know what a mortgage was, but she understood that the house was theirs in a way it had not been before, in the way that children understood the large things through the small details that surrounded them. Marlene noticed her daughter moving through the house differently in the weeks that followed, with a settledness, a groundedness that showed in the way she left her shoes by the door instead of near the door, and arranged her books on the shelf with a care she had not previously applied. Children knew. They always knew, even before they had the language for what they knew. The first stones moved through Helene's private placement process in the autumn. The returns exceeded the appraisal range on 3 of the exceptional lots. Helene called to report each result with the pleased efficiency of someone whose professional judgment had been confirmed, which she accepted as the baseline expectation of professional judgment. Marlene received each number with the same careful steadiness she had applied to every other number in this process, writing them in a new notebook whose columns were the inverse of the old ones. She gave generously, and she gave quietly. This was a decision she had made early, with Patricia's guidance and her own clear conviction, and she did not waver from it. A portion to the school Maya attended, directed toward the scholarship fund that she knew from personal knowledge was insufficient for what it was trying to do. A portion to the food bank where she had been a client once, briefly, in the worst month of the worst period of the last 2 years. Doc, when she had stood in the line with her coat collar turned up and her heart turned down and taken what was offered, with a gratitude she had been too ashamed at the time to fully feel. She went back there now with a check, and with the absence of a collar turned up, and with a gratitude that was older and wider, and no longer contaminated by shame. Denise cried when Marlene told her what she had done, not about the money itself, about the food bank. "You never told me," Denise said. "Well, I know. You should have told me." "I know," Marlene said again. "I wasn't ready to be known that way. I am. Now." Denise wiped her eyes with her sleeve, in the way that was particular to her, brisk and unapologetic, and then she straightened and looked at her sister with the full attention she had been giving her for 41 years. "You're different," she said. "I'm the same," Marlene said. "I'm just not afraid." The Calloway Casino was assessed by a preservation architect in the early winter. The assessment confirmed what Marlene had suspected from her first careful walk of the space, that the building was fundamentally sound, that its period construction was unusual for the region, that it had bones worth keeping. She had been thinking about this since the summer, in the spaces between the legal and financial work, on turning it over with the same methodical attention she turned everything over with. She did not sell the building. She commissioned its renovation. The vision had come to her gradually, assembling itself from details she had absorbed over months of visiting the space. The large main floor with its high ceiling and its history of noise and movement. The back section that could be opened and expanded. The upper floor that could become office space or classroom space, or the kind of quiet room where people came to think about things that mattered to them. She had thought about the people who had come to the Calloway in its operational years, about luck and the particular human need to believe in it. And she had thought about what a building that had once been devoted to chance might become, when what it offered instead was certainty. She called it the Calloway Center. It opened 14 months later as a community resource space, a part vocational training facility, part financial literacy program, part child care cooperative for parents who were working the way she had been working, without margin, without room for error, calculating every week against a column that refused to balance. She hired a director with experience in nonprofit management and an advisory board that included Patricia Hess and a woman from the food bank and a retired teacher who had reached out after hearing about the renovation and asked, with the directness of someone who had been teaching long enough to have stopped being indirect about things that mattered, whether there was a place for her. There was. There was a place for everyone she needed. On the day the center opened, she stood in the main room, which had been restored to something that honored its structure without pretending to restore its original purpose, clean and open and lit with natural light from windows that had been uncovered and reglazed, the floors refinished down to the original hardwood that had been concealed under decades of carpet and concrete sealer. People moved through the space with the particular energy of a first day, tentative and curious, and warmer than first days usually were, because they had heard the story of the building and the story of the woman who had found it, and stories that people have heard before they arrive give them a way of being present that bare introductions do not. Maya was there, and she was wearing her good shoes, the ones she had chosen herself from a store where she had been allowed to choose anything she wanted, which had resulted in a pair of bright yellow sneakers that she wore with the authority of someone who had made a decision they stood behind completely. She moved through the center the way she moved through everywhere, with full commitment and no particular concern for how her commitment appeared to others. She stopped at the entrance to the room where the child care cooperative was set up and looked at the small chairs and the low tables and the shelves of books and materials with an expression Marlene recognized. "I want to work here," Maya said. "When I grow up." "What would you do?" Marlene asked. Maya considered the room. "I would make sure all the kids felt safe," she said. "That would be the main thing." Marlene looked at her daughter in her yellow shoes with her 8-year-old certainty and her mother's discipline and her own particular light that was nothing like anyone else's light and everything like the best version of everything Marlene had hoped for her. "That would be exactly the right main thing," she said. Later that evening, so after the opening had wound down and the last guests had gone and the director had locked the front doors with the new keys that still stuck slightly, the way new keys did, Marlene sat alone in the main room of the Calloway Center. The lights were on low. The room was quiet in the particular way of a space that had been full of people and was now resting between uses. She could hear, faintly, the evening sounds of the countryside outside the cleaned windows. A car on the road. Wind in the trees that had grown through the parking lot and been preserved rather than removed, because she had decided that things that grew in the absence of care had earned the right to remain. She sat in the middle of the floor and looked at the room she had made from the room she had been given. She thought about the shaft beneath her feet, sealed now, documented, preserved as a historical feature that would be explained to the center's visitors as part of the building's story, which was the right way to treat the thing that had changed everything. Not hidden, not displayed with spectacle, simply present and explained, and given the meaning that honest explanation gave to things that had been important. She thought about Richard Calloway, who had built this place and had put beneath it the most significant thing he owned, and had not lived to see what became of it. She thought about the people who had owned the building between then and now, who had walked above the room without knowing, whose ordinary decisions and ordinary failures had moved the property along the chain that ended with her. She thought about her father, who had accepted a deed in payment for a debt from a man who had died without descendants, who had carried the deed without ever knowing what it held, who had left it to her in the only way he had ever left her anything, which was to say without ceremony, without explanation, so through the administrative aftermath of a life that had not been tidy enough to plan. She thought about what Patricia had said at the beginning. Clear title. The property is yours. Everything within it is yours. She thought about how she had stood on the drive home that first evening in the early spring, with the light doing what early spring light did, and she had let herself believe just a little that her father had not left her nothing after all. She had been right. He had left her exactly enough. He had left her the door. The rest she had opened herself. She sat in the quiet of the room she had made and let the feeling be what it was, large and real and entirely her own. Not the feeling of luck, because luck was what you hoped for when you had no other strategy, but the feeling of something harder and more reliable than luck. The feeling of having paid attention, of having measured before she moved, of having held the cold chisel steady and listened for the sound that told the truth about what was underneath. She thought about the notebook with the failing columns in her kitchen drawer, the one she had not looked at since the summer. She thought about opening it one day and drawing a single line through every entry, not in anger, not in triumph, but in the quiet acknowledgement of a chapter that had done what hard chapters did, so which was to teach you who you were when what you had was taken away, and to give you back to yourself more accurately than comfort ever could. She was not going to be a person who was defined by the $305 million. She had thought about this carefully and come to it clearly, the way she came to things that mattered. She was going to be the person she had been becoming for the last 2 years, and the one who breathed through difficulty and measured before she moved and refused the offer of silence and climbed the ladder back up into the light. The money was what it was, a transformation, a security, a gift delivered through the strangest possible channel in the strangest possible form by a stranger she would never meet. But the person who had found the room was the person she had already become. The building held its quiet around her. Outside, the wind moved through the preserved trees in the parking lot, the ones that had pushed up through the old asphalt with the patient determination of things that grew when no one was watching. She could hear them. She sat in the light of the room she had made and listened to them for a long time. Then she picked up her coat, turned off the lights, and walked to her car. She drove home through the spring evening, the way she had driven every road of the last 2 years, with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on what was ahead. Maya was at Denise's. The house was quiet when she let herself in, the kitchen holding its familiar smell of dinner past, and the faint sweetness of Maya's apple juice, and the old wood of a place that had been lived in long enough to have its own particular character. She crossed to the refrigerator. The pineapple magnet held its position on the door, and beneath it, while alongside the weather system project and the class calendar and the shopping list in Maya's optimistic handwriting that included items no 7-year-old needed from a grocery store, was the diamond drawing from the day Maya learned what diamonds were made of. Pressure, Marlene had said, and time. She touched the edge of the drawing and stood in her kitchen and felt the full weight of what her life had become, which was to say, the full weight of what she had built it into. A one measured step at a time, through the years that had tried to define her by what she lacked, and had instead revealed what she was made of. The house was hers. The center was open. The columns balanced. She went to bed and she slept deeply, the way a person slept when the work of the day had been exactly the work the day required, and when the room they were sleeping in was theirs, and when the child down the hall was safe, and when the thing they had been afraid of losing was no longer in danger of being lost. She slept the way a person slept who had been, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where they were supposed to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.